How Apple almost went bankrupt, then became a $3 trillion company. In 1997, Apple was 90 days away from going completely broke. The company that would one day be worth $3 trillion was bleeding money, losing customers, and being laughed at by the entire tech industry. This is the story of the greatest comeback in business history. Let's go back to the beginning. It's 1976. Two guys named Steve are building computers in a garage in Los Altos, California. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak didn't have money. They didn't have a business plan. What they had was an idea that personal computers could change the world. And they were right. By 1980, Apple went public. The IPO made $300 million in a single day. Steve Jobs was 25 years old and worth over $200 million. He was on the cover of magazines. He was the golden boy of Silicon Valley. And then everything fell apart. See, Jobs was brilliant, but he was also impossible to work with. He screamed at engineers. He insulted people in meetings. He pushed projects that the board didn't believe in. So in 1985, Apple's own board of directors kicked Steve Jobs out of the company he created. Think about that. The guy who built Apple, fired from Apple. Jobs was devastated. He later said it felt like getting punched in the stomach so hard he couldn't breathe. But here's the thing about getting knocked down that hard. Sometimes it's the best thing that ever happens to you. Meanwhile, back at Apple, things started to go very, very wrong. Without Jobs, the company lost its identity. They made dozens of products nobody asked for: printers, game consoles, a camera called the QuickTake, a thing called the Newton, which was supposed to be a handheld computer but could barely recognize your handwriting. They were throwing spaghetti at the wall, and none of it was sticking. By the mid-90s, Microsoft had completely taken over. Windows was everywhere. Apple's market share had dropped from 16% down to about 4%. They were losing over $1 billion a year. Let me say that again. $1 billion a year. Gone. CEOs came and went. Gil Amelio took over in 1996 and tried to stop the bleeding, but the company was in freefall. Amelio himself later admitted that Apple was like a ship with a hole in it, and his job was just to point it in the right direction. The press was writing obituaries. Michael Dell, the guy who started Dell Computers, was asked what he'd do if he ran Apple. His answer? He'd shut it down and give the money back to shareholders. That's how bad it was. So what changed? Steve Jobs came back. In late 1996, Apple bought a small company called Next for $427 million. Next was the company Jobs had started after getting kicked out of Apple. The deal was supposed to be about the software, but the real acquisition was Jobs himself. By 1997, he was back in charge, and he didn't waste a single day. The first thing he did was slash. He looked at Apple's product line, which had ballooned to over 40 different products, and he killed almost all of them. He grabbed a marker, drew a simple grid on a whiteboard, and said Apple would make 4 things. 4. A desktop and a laptop for regular people. A desktop and a laptop for professionals. That's it. Everything else was gone. People inside Apple were terrified. Engineers who'd spent years on projects watched them get cancelled overnight. But Jobs didn't care about feelings. He cared about focus. Then he did something nobody saw coming. He called Bill Gates. Microsoft and Apple had been rivals for years, but Jobs swallowed his pride and made a deal. Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple. In exchange, Microsoft Office would keep running on Mac computers. The crowd at Macworld actually booed when Gates appeared on screen. But that money, it kept the lights on. It bought Apple time. And then came the iMac. August 1998. Apple released a computer that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before. It was translucent, it was blue, it was shaped like a gumdrop. People thought it was weird, but they also couldn't stop staring at it. The iMac sold 800,000 units in its first 5 months. Apple was profitable again for the first time in years, but Jobs was just getting started. In 2001, he launched two things that would change the world. The first was iTunes. The second was a little white device called the iPod. 1,000 songs in your pocket. That was the pitch, and it worked. The iPod didn't just save Apple, it turned Apple into a cultural force. Then, on January 9th, 2007, Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and said something that still gives people chills. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. The iPhone changed everything. It changed how we communicate, how we take photos, how we get directions, listen to music, read the news, order food. It wasn't just a product, it was a revolution. In its first year, Apple sold 6 million iPhones. Within a few years, it became the most profitable product in human history. After the iPhone came the App Store, then the iPad, then the Apple Watch, then AirPods. Each one opened a new door, created a new market, built a new layer of an ecosystem that locked hundreds of millions of people into the Apple world. By August 2018, Apple became the first publicly traded company to reach a market cap of $1 trillion. 2 years later, it hit $2 trillion, and in 2022, it crossed $3 trillion. From 90 days away from bankruptcy to the most valuable company on the planet. Now, here's what I want you to think about. Steve Jobs didn't save Apple by playing it safe. He didn't save it by copying what Microsoft was doing. He saved it by stripping everything away until only the essential remained. He bet on simplicity when the world was drowning in complexity. He bet on design when everyone else was betting on specs. And he almost never got the chance. If Apple's board hadn't bought Next in 1996, if they'd gone with a different company, chosen a different path, there's a very real chance Apple wouldn't exist today. No iMac, no iPod, no iPhone, no $3 trillion empire. All of it hinged on one decision. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What's the thing you got fired from? What's the thing that knocked you down so hard you couldn't breathe? Because Steve Jobs would tell you, that might be exactly where your comeback starts.